Hello there, welcome to saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground. Now, with the upcoming release of the Tetris movie, plotting out the history and complicated backstory behind the release of this game, we thought at saberduelgaming now would be the perfect time to look back at one of the most iconic games. And whilst this movie is going to focus on how this game was created, conceived, the legal battles behind it, we will be looking at the game itself and specifically the Game Boy version. So, with an advance warning not to expect the most flashy visual video you've ever seen, welcome to saberduelgaming and welcome to Tetris, a retro review. Now, Nintendo has a long history of using puzzle games for their earlier consoles. The Game Boy and Nintendo Entertainment System especially were littered with simplistic puzzle games that tried to capture the imagination whilst using minimal graphics. They still managed to be quite pretty, but none of them were ever as successful or as iconic as Tetris. Tetris was originally created in 1984 by Alexei Pajitnov, and he had put together a truly simplistic but also addictive game. Built around 7 different pieces, 2 of which were just simple mirror opposites of themselves. These pieces would fall down a screen and form lines. If the player could complete a line, that line would disappear, giving you points. If you were unable to delete any lines, the columns would build and build and build until eventually it would fill the screen, and that was it, game over. And whilst this was originally designed, conceived and promoted on home computers, it was on the Game Boy for Nintendo that this game would become so iconic. I first played this game in 1989 when it was released with the Nintendo Game Boy. And it was the perfect package deal. It was an addictive puzzler that many people wouldn't have necessarily bought on its own. But once you plugged in Tetris and you started playing it, you really became addicted. Type B was the much more relaxed version of the game. This was one where you picked a difficulty level, how much junk you wanted to start on the screen, and then had to try and eliminate 25 lines. Many people ended up calling it 25 line mode because of this. That was more pick up and play fun. Type A was the opposite. Type A was the long-lasting, never-ending mode, where the game just continued to pile bricks at you, going faster, becoming more difficult, and being pretty much never-ending. This was Tetris at its most complicated, but also maybe at its most compelling. If you knew someone with a Game Boy and had the connection cable, there was also a 2-player version of the game that would shoehorn Mario and Luigi in menu screens into it. But I'll be honest, I never played this, so I'm not really going to comment on it too much. So, let's see, how was Tetris received back in 1989 when people first played it on the Nintendo Game Boy? Well, unsurprisingly, exceptionally well. This game has been often credited with being one of the main reasons the Nintendo Game Boy sold so well. Whilst games such as Super Mario Land would go on to be very successful also, Tetris was the one game that everyone started with, and if you couldn't afford many other games, you knew you started with an absolute classic. It was one of the first Game Boy games that all the Nintendo and generic games magazines reviewed, and it generally got scores between 80 to 90%, which is exceptionally good considering how basic and simplistic this game is. And you also have to bear in mind, not everyone is a fan of puzzle video games. For it to get scores that high, with that being a factor, is remarkable. It was also one of the first video games that genuinely appealed to non-gamers. This is something Nintendo have always excelled with games like Brain Training, Wii Sports and Nintendogs, but this was the first one that really took this type of game to people that were not interested in gaming. My mum was a perfect example. Whenever I wasn't playing on my Game Boy, she was, and she was only playing Tetris. There's even been a number of studies that suggest that playing Tetris actually increases people's brain capacity, something that was looked at a lot more with games like Brain Training later down the line. But it all really started the concept of educational games right here with Tetris. As the years passed, the game would go on to be named in the top 10 Game Boy games of all time, unsurprisingly, and would also be named in the number 5 place in the top 100 Nintendo video games of all time, which is a much more impressive feat. Alexei Puchinov, the creator of the game as mentioned earlier, would also go on to say that this was his favourite version of the game and the closest version to his original creation. The game would go on to be released on pretty much every other console that ever came out, and not just Nintendo. Eventually, most other home consoles garnered the rights to Tetris at some point or another. But this version of the game is truly the most iconic, and in my opinion, the best. And I'm going to throw it out there right now. The whole modern scrutiny, what about now? This game is just as addictive, as engaging, and as fun as it always was. And this is the perfect time to also mention the iconic Tetris music. The music in this game was always so enjoyable and compelling, and going back to it again to play for this review, I absolutely loved hearing that tune again. There's a reason why the new Tetris movie trailer includes an adaptation of the Tetris music in the background, because you can't create the feel and history of that game without that tune. And there's a few tunes in this game, but we all know the one we're talking about. The Tetris music is as iconic as the game itself, and is one of the reasons it's so beloved. Replaying this game for this review was an absolute joy, and if anything, I probably appreciate it more now I'm older than I did when I was younger. Back then, I usually wanted to throw in the slightly more flashy Super Mario Land or Terminator 2 Judgment Day, but now going back, I can appreciate that this is a game that is aged like fine wine. So with that said, how does this game score? Well, sometimes these classic games don't rate as highly anymore because the graphics just don't stand the test of time, maybe even the gameplay. But this game never tried to have fancy graphics, and the gameplay is still perfect. This game easily deserves a rating of 8.5 out of 10, and goddammit, I love that music. But what do you think? Comment below, let me know, and until next time, take the high ground.